Picture this. It's the summer of 1659. June. The steppe is burning under a sun so fierce, it turns the horizon into a shimmer of white heat. The grass is tall, dry, and gold as hammered copper. The air smells of horse sweat, gunpowder residue, and dust. So much dust that men spit brown, and breathe brown, and die with brown caking the blood on their lips. You are a Muscovite cavalry officer. You rode out of Moscow weeks ago with one of the greatest armies your Tsar has ever assembled. Around you, stretching in every direction as far as your eyes can reach, are soldiers. Tens of thousands of them, riders in their iron breastplates. Streltsy musketeers with their long-barreled fusils. Cossack auxiliaries, dragoons, artillery trains. The rumble of this force moving across the Ukrainian steppe is like the sound of a slow or inevitable earthquake. You have never seen so many men gathered in one place. Neither has anyone else in this part of the world. Your commander is Prince Alexei Nikitich Trubetskoy. He is confident. His orders are simple and brutal. Advance into Ukraine, crush the Cossack Hetmanate and its new allies, and bring this rebellious land to heel under the Romanov Tsar's iron grip once and for all. The Cossacks made the mistake of looking elsewhere for protection. They will pay for it. You pass through village after village. Some are empty. The people have fled, taking their livestock, their icons, their children. Others watch you from doorways with the flat, expressionless eyes of people who have watched armies come and go before and know that whichever army it is, the result is always the same for them: hunger, fire, and grief. And then you reach a small town on the northern bank of a river called the Konotop, and everything stops. Because what is waiting for you there, what is hiding behind that town, concealed in the reeds and marshland beyond, is going to erase 50,000 of your comrades from the earth before the day is done. It's going to shatter Muscovite military prestige for a generation. It's going to change the entire trajectory of Eastern European history. And not a single one of you sees it coming. That's the battle we're talking about today. Konotop, June 28th, 1659. One of the most catastrophic and least told military disasters in Russian history. A battle so devastating that Tsar Alexis reportedly wept when he heard the news and ordered the entire city of Moscow into mourning. On a battle that wiped out the flower of the Muscovite noble cavalry in a single afternoon. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is about the battles, the leaders, and the catastrophic miscalculations that shaped the world we live in. History told the way it actually felt, with blood and strategy and the terrible weight of human decisions made under impossible pressure. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you is going to stay with you. And if you've been watching from Ukraine, from Poland, from Russia, drop that in the comments. This story belongs to all of you. Let's get into it. Before we go any further, let me be absolutely clear about what this battle was really about. Because Konotop 1659 is not a minor regional skirmish. It is not a footnote. It is a hinge point. One of those rare, violent moments where the future of entire nations, entire civilizations, is decided in the span of a few hours. Think about what was at stake. Ukraine in 1659 is not a quiet backwater. It is the contested heart of Eastern Europe, the breadbasket of the continent, the crossroads between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Muscovite state, the homeland of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, the most ferocious and independent fighting force on the entire continent. Whoever controls Ukraine controls the steppe. Whoever controls the steppe controls the flow of grain, trade, and military power across the whole of Eastern Europe. And in 1659, Three great powers are fighting to own it. Muscovy, the rising tsardom that would one day become the Russian Empire, wants Ukraine as a province, a subordinate territory, a buffer against its enemies. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once the largest state in Europe, now bleeding from decades of war, wants it back as part of its old empire. And the Cossack Hetmanate itself, led by some of the most brilliant and tortured political minds of the age, wants something entirely different. It wants to exist. It wants autonomy. It wants to be a nation. The Battle of Konotop is the moment when those three ambitions collide with maximum violence. If Trubetskoy's army wins here, if it crushes the Cossacks and their Polish and Tatar allies, if it forces the Hetmanate into total submission, then Muscovy swallows Ukraine. The Cossacks become subjects of the Tsar. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is pushed back, and the road to Russian imperial domination of Eastern Europe opens 200 years early. Nay, but if the Muscovites lose, if this massive, confident army is broken here in the dust of the Ukrainian steppe, then everything changes. The Cossack Hetmanate survives. Polish influence returns. Muscovy is humiliated. The balance of power in the entire region shifts. This is not just a battle. This is the future being decided. Remember that as we go. To understand why 50,000 Muscovite soldiers are standing in the Ukrainian summer heat in 1659, we need to go back about 15 years. Back to 1648. Back to one of the most violent and consequential uprisings in European history. His name was Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and he was about to set the world on fire. Khmelnytsky was a Cossack officer, a sotnik, a captain of 100 men, educated, ambitious, and deeply aggrieved. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been using the Zaporozhian Cossacks as military muscle for decades. They were brilliant fighters, feared across the continent, and they had saved the Commonwealth's skin in more battles than anyone cared to count. But in return, they were denied the social status, the political rights, and the dignity they believed they had earned. The Polish nobility looked at the Cossacks as useful savages, and Khmelnytsky, who had studied at a Jesuit college and could argue theology with bishops, was not going to swallow that forever. In 1648, something personal broke him open. A Polish nobleman named Saplinski stole his estate, kidnapped his wife, and beat his son nearly to death. When Khmelnytsky appealed to the Polish courts and got nothing, laughed at, dismissed, he did what Cossacks did when words ran out. And he went to war, and the uprising he launched was unlike anything Eastern Europe had seen in a generation. He allied with the Crimean Tatars, the fearsome Muslim horsemen of the southern steppe, and turned on the Commonwealth with a fury that no one had anticipated. At Zhovty Vody, Korsun, and Batij, his combined Cossack-Tatar forces shredded Polish armies one after another. At the Battle of Batij in 1652, he surrounded and annihilated a Polish force of over 20,000 men. The Commonwealth's military prestige, which had seemed unshakable, suddenly looked very fragile indeed. For 6 years, Khmelnytsky led a Cossack state, the Hetmanate, that effectively functioned as an independent nation. It had its own army, its own courts, its own administration. It was something genuinely new in the world. But independence in 17th century Eastern Europe was not something a small state could maintain alone. You needed a protector. You needed a great power at your back. And Khmelnytsky spent those years desperately searching for one. He tried the Ottomans. They were interested but unreliable. He tried the Swedes. They were too far away and too distracted by their own wars. He tried the Transylvanians. They were too weak. And eventually, cornered and running out of options, he turned to the one power he had been avoiding, Muscovy. In January 1654, at a town called Pereyaslavl, a council of Cossack officers gathered and took an oath of loyalty to Tsar Alexis of Russia. The exact terms of what was agreed at Pereyaslavl have been debated by historians ever since. The Cossacks believed they were entering a military alliance, equal partners, their autonomy preserved. The Muscovites believed they were annexing a province. Those two completely different interpretations of the same moment were going to cause a catastrophe. The scale of what Khmelnytsky had created was extraordinary and fragile in equal measure. The Zaporozhian host, the Cossack military and political organism that formed the spine of the Hetmanate, was not a standing army in the European sense. It was a nation in arms, where every registered Cossack was both a soldier and a citizen, where the hetman's authority flowed upward from below as much as it descended from above, and where political decisions were made in the great councils called radas that could, and regularly did, overturn the decisions of leaders who had lost the faith of the rank and file. This made the Hetmanate flexible, resilient, and maddeningly difficult to govern in a sustained political direction. Khmelnytsky had managed it through a combination of charisma, military genius, and the unifying force of common enemies. But even he could not hold it all together indefinitely. The later years of his Hetmanate were marked by increasingly desperate diplomatic maneuvering. The alliance with the Tatars was always conditional. Khan Islam III Giray had his own interests, and those interests did not always align with Ukrainian survival. When the Tatars suddenly withdrew at the Battle of Berestechko in 1651, taking the hetman himself hostage, the result was a catastrophic Cossack defeat against the Poles. When Muscovy finally agreed to the Pereyaslavl arrangement in 1654, part of what drove it was pure exhaustion, the sense that there was no alternative left. But the years between 1654 and Khmelnytsky's death in 1657 were not peaceful. They were filled with the grinding friction of two fundamentally incompatible visions for what the relationship between the Hetmanate and Moscow actually meant. Muscovite voivodes, military governors, arrived in Cossack cities and immediately began acting as if those cities were Russian provinces, while Cossack officers who had commanded armies and signed treaties as representatives of a sovereign state were suddenly being treated as subordinate officials who needed permission from Moscow to make routine decisions. The letters that flew back and forth between Chaihyran, the hetman's capital, and Moscow during those years are full of barely suppressed rage on the Cossack side and barely concealed condescension on the Muscovite side. Khmelnytsky died in August 1657 in Chaihyran, reportedly after a series of strokes that had left him increasingly incapacitated in his final months. He was 59 years old. He had spent nearly the last decade of his life at war, building something unprecedented, watching it crack, and unable to stop the cracking. And his legacy was a nation that existed, but could not yet sustain itself. A political entity balanced on the knife edge between great power patronage and genuine independence, and tipping slowly, inexorably, toward the former. His successor, Ivan Vyhovsky, inherited all of this. The broken alliances, the internal factions, the Muscovite pressure, the Tatar unpredictability, the restless and politically conscious Cossack host who trusted their hetman only as far as their last vote allowed. He also inherited Khmelnytsky's secretary's perspective, the view from the paperwork, from the correspondence, from the treaties. He had seen clearly from the inside just how dangerous the Pereyaslavl arrangement was. And into that moment of fragile inheritance and building crisis, Trubetskoy's army marched. Prince Alexei Nikitich Trubetskoy was not a man prone to self-doubt. And looking at what he commanded in the summer of 1659, who could blame him? The force he led into Ukraine was, by any measure, a military colossus. Contemporary estimates range between 50 and 60,000 men. Some accounts push even higher. Whatever the exact number, this was one of the largest armies Muscovy had ever put in the field. And it was not just large, it was modern. It was equipped with the most up-to-date weapons and tactical systems that Russian money and German expertise could provide. The core of Trubetskoy's cavalry was his retirs, heavy horsemen trained in the European style, armed with pistols, carbines, and sabers, wearing iron breastplates and lobster-tail helmets. These men were organized and drilled according to Western European military manuals. They were not the old-fashioned Russian noble cavalry of a generation earlier, who had charged with bows and expected individual glory. These were disciplined, formation-trained soldiers who could execute complex tactical maneuvers on command. Alongside them were the Streltsy, Muscovy's professional musketeers, the backbone of Russian infantry. Armed with matchlock muskets and equipped with polearms for close combat, they were organized into regiments with their own officers and supply chains. They had been fighting and training continuously for decades. They were veterans. Then there was the artillery. Muscovy, in 1659, had invested heavily in its cannon foundries. Trubetskoy's train included dozens of field guns, not the massive siege bombards of an earlier era, but mobile, practical weapons designed to be moved with an army and employed in pitched battle. Against enemies that lacked equivalent firepower, they were decisive. And behind all of this was the logistical weight of the Muscovite state, one of the great powers of the continent. Supply wagons, remounts, powder magazines, field forges. Trubetskoy could sustain a siege. He had the men and the material to simply sit in front of a fortified position and grind it into dust. That is exactly what he planned to do. His objective was the town of Konotop, held by a Cossack garrison loyal to Hetman Vyhovsky, Khmelnytsky's successor, the man who had broken with Moscow and was now aligned with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Von Vyhovsky had roughly 4,000 men inside Konotop. Against Trubetskoy's 60,000-strong army, this looked like a formality. Surround the town, bring up the guns, dig siege lines, and wait. The garrison would run out of food within weeks. Vyhovsky would surrender, and the Ukrainian question would be settled by sheer weight of force. In military history, there is a pattern that repeats itself with terrible consistency. The moment an army becomes large enough to seem unstoppable, it stops being careful. It stops imagining that the enemy could have anything meaningful in reserve. It stops thinking about what it cannot see. Trubetskoy had one other problem that he did not adequately account for, and it was a cultural one as much as a military one. The Muscovite noble cavalry, the Dvoryanskaya Konitsia, the horsemen who formed the elite of his force, carried with them an institutional attitude toward the Cossacks and the Tatars that was simultaneously accurate about the past and catastrophically wrong about the present. They had seen the Tatars retreat before. They had chased Cossack formations that broke and ran. They had the psychological memory of enemies who eventually gave way, who could be intimidated by mass and momentum. That memory was not wrong. It was simply out of date. It did not account for Vyhovsky's planning. It did not account for 3 months of preparation. It did not account for the fact that an enemy who has chosen the ground is not the same enemy who was caught in the open. Trubetskoy was about to demonstrate that pattern with 50,000 lives. Think about that. 60,000 men. The kind of force that darkens the horizon. The kind of force that makes entire populations pack their carts and flee south. And yet, within a single summer afternoon, the most important part of it, the cavalry arm, the cream of Muscovite military power, will cease to exist. Imagine standing there in that army, the confidence you would feel, the certainty of victory, the total catastrophic failure of imagination about what was coming next. Ivan Vyhovsky was one of the most complicated men in an age of complicated men. He had been Khmelnytsky's secretary, the great Hetman's chief administrator, the man who kept the records, drafted the letters, managed the impossible logistics of running a state at war. He was educated in ways most Cossack officers were not, fluent in Latin and Polish, and familiar with the concepts of European diplomacy and law. And he was deeply, fundamentally aware that the agreement at Pereyaslavl was a trap. Muscovy did not want a partner. It wanted a province. Every interaction Vyhovsky had with Muscovite officials after 1654 confirmed it. Moscow kept appointing its own administrators to Cossack towns. Moscow kept demanding military service without consultation. Moscow kept treating Cossack officers, men who had won battles that Muscovite generals could only dream of, as subordinates to be given orders, not commanders to be negotiated with. Vyhovsky watched this happening and made a decision that took extraordinary political courage, because he knew what it would cost him. In 1658, he signed the Treaty of Hadiak with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Under this treaty, the Cossack Hetmanate would become a full, equal partner in the Commonwealth, a third constituent nation alongside Poland and Lithuania, with its own laws, its own army, and its own noble class. On paper, it was the most favorable agreement the Cossacks had ever negotiated. Real autonomy, real dignity. But it came at a price. To get there, he had to fight Muscovy. To fight Muscovy, he needed allies that could match Muscovite numbers. And there was only one force in the region capable of that: the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Khanate was the most mobile military force in Eastern Europe. Their cavalry, tens of thousands of horse archers and light riders who could cover 100 miles in a day, had been the decisive factor in Khmelnytsky's greatest victories. They did not fight the way Muscovite reiters or Polish hussars fought. They did not charge in formations and hold ground. They flowed. They surrounded. They feigned retreat and drew enemies forward into prepared killing grounds. They had been doing this for centuries, and they were still the best in the world at it. Vyhovsky negotiated with Khan Mehmed IV Giray, and the Khan agreed to bring his full force into the field. Between 20,000 and 30,000, Tatar horsemen would join the Cossacks for the campaign of 1659. But Vyhovsky's situation was still desperate. He had political enemies among the Cossacks themselves, officers who genuinely believed the alliance with Moscow was the right choice, or who simply mistrusted him personally, or who were already taking Moscow's money. His own territory was fractured. Parts of the Hetmanate refused to follow him. He had, at most, 16,000 Cossack troops he could actually count on, and he was facing 60,000 battle-hardened Muscovite soldiers. So he did what brilliant commanders do when they cannot match their enemy's strength. He decided not to fight that strength. He decided to dig a hole and fill it with bait. The town of Konotop and its 4,000-man garrison commanded by Colonel Hryhory Khmelnytsky was not just a defensive position, it was a mousetrap. Khmelnytsky's orders were not to win. His orders were to survive, to hold the siege long enough, to draw the Muscovite army in, to keep Trubetskoy's attention focused entirely on those walls, while Vyhovsky prepared the real weapon hidden in the marshland and grassland to the south. For 3 months, Khmelnytsky's garrison held. 3 months of artillery bombardment, assault, counter-assault. 3 months of watching the walls crumble and being repaired with rubble and timber. 3 months of men dying on the ramparts and being replaced by men who were also going to die. They held because they had to. Because if they broke, if they surrendered before Vyhovsky was ready, then everything collapsed. The Cossack decoy force that appeared in the open field south of the siege lines was commanded by some of Vyhovsky's most trusted officers. Men who understood that their job was to ride in plain view of 60,000 enemies and make it look like a mistake, make it look like impulsiveness or desperation or bad judgment, make it look like exactly the kind of opportunity that an overconfident general would jump at. They rode slowly enough to be seen, quickly enough to be chased, at exactly the right distance to make pursuit look feasible. Every detail was calibrated, the size of the force, visible and countable, large enough to seem worth pursuing, not so large as to seem like a trap. The direction of their movement, angling south and west toward the Izhuk crossing, drawing the Muscovite cavalry in the exact direction that led into the marshland. The timing, morning, when the summer sun was still manageable and men were full of energy and the confidence of a 3-month siege that was nearly over. Vyhovsky had been watching Pozharsky and Lvov for weeks. He knew how they thought. He knew what they wanted. A quick, decisive cavalry action that would wrap up the campaign before it became a prolonged, expensive affair. He gave them exactly that. Or rather, he gave them the appearance of exactly that. To the engineering of perception. That is what Konotop truly was, before a single sword was drawn south of the Izhuk River. 3 months. Think about what 3 months of siege means for a garrison of 4,000 men. It means counting food. It means measuring the water in the cisterns. It means watching the walls breach and breach again, and being patched again with whatever is at hand. Furniture, rubble, the bodies of the fallen filled in with earth and rammed down into the gaps. It means sleeping in rotation, because the Muscovite artillery does not stop for the night, not entirely. It means the smell of gunpowder and burning that becomes so familiar it disappears from conscious awareness, and the men only notice it when, in the rare, quiet hours between bombardments, it is briefly replaced by the summer grass smell from beyond the walls. Khmelnytsky's men were not just soldiers. They were instruments of a plan they could only partially see. They knew Vyhovsky was coming. They had to believe it. Because if they stopped believing it, if even a few of them broke, or if a sortie failed badly enough that the walls became truly untenable, then the trap failed before it was ever sprung. Konotop held because 4,000 men decided that their suffering had a purpose, that their dying had a destination. The moment that broke the dam came in late June 1659, and it came from inside the Muscovite camp. For weeks, Trubetskoy had been receiving reports about Vyhovsky's movements, about a large force gathering somewhere to the south. His scouts had picked up traces of Tatar activity. Some of the local Cossacks who came into the Muscovite camp with information whispered about tens of thousands of horsemen waiting beyond the marshes. Trubetskoy chose not to believe it, or rather, and this is the critical thing, he chose to believe the version of reality that was most comfortable. Yes, the Tatars were probably around somewhere, but Mehmed IV Giray had retreated from battlefields before when threatened. The Tatars were raiders, not field soldiers. And Vyhovsky? Vyhovsky was trapped behind his walls, surrounded, his garrison eating horsemeat and burning furniture for warmth. He had days left, maybe a week. And then, on the morning of June 28th, something happened that shattered Trubetskoy's carefully maintained confidence. A Cossack force appeared in the open field south of the siege lines, not hiding, not cautious, openly deployed, riding in clear view of the Muscovite positions, apparently daring the Russians to come out and fight. The temptation was electric. Here was Vyhovsky, or a portion of his force, stupid enough to show himself in the open, far from the walls, without the protection of the fortifications. Here was the chance to strike before the siege was even complete. Destroy the relief force, then take the town at leisure. It would be over by evening. 2 Muscovite cavalry commanders, Princes Semyon Pozharsky and Semyon Lvov, seized the moment without waiting for detailed orders. When they led their forces out of the siege lines, somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 cavalry, the best horsemen Trubetskoy had, surging forward in pursuit of the Cossacks, who turned and began falling back. The Cossacks were fast, always just ahead, always staying close enough to look catchable, but never close enough to be caught. The Muscovite horsemen pressed harder. This was going perfectly. The enemy was running. This would be over in an hour. They were still thinking that thought when the marsh closed around them, because the Cossacks had not been retreating. They had been leading. Now let's talk about the battlefield, because you need to understand the terrain to understand what happened next. The area around Konotop is not open steppe, not in June. The Izhuk River runs south of the town, and its floodplain in the summer is a maze of wetlands, boggy ground, reed beds, and water meadows. There are areas that look like solid field, but aren't. Ground that will hold a man on foot, but will suck a horse's legs to the knee and hold them there like iron. Between the marshier areas, there are dry corridors, natural paths through the wetland that were perfect for channeling movement. Vyhovsky and Khan Mehmed IV Giray had spent weeks studying this ground. They knew every dry path and every boggy trap. They had positioned their full combined force, 16,000 Cossacks, and somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Tatar cavalry, on the far side of the marshes, concealed in the rolling ground beyond the Izhuk. They had one section of the river where there was a crossing, a causeway or ford wide enough to let troops move through, and they had used it carefully, keeping their main force hidden until the moment came. The Cossack force that had appeared in the open and drawn out Pozharsky and Lvov had crossed back through that ford. And now the Muscovite cavalry was chasing them toward it, not knowing that on the other side, tens of thousands of warriors were waiting. Think of it this way. Imagine a funnel. The narrow end is the crossing over the Izhuk. The wide end is the open ground where the Muscovite cavalry is riding. The Cossacks have drawn their enemy into that funnel, and on the other side of the narrow point, Khan Mehmed IV Giray has arranged his Tatar horsemen in a great semicircle, spread wide, and are ready to close like a pair of hands clapping around whatever comes through. The Muscovite cavalry hit the crossing zone. Some of them pushed across. Some of them began dealing with the boggy ground, horses stumbling, formations breaking apart. The neat, disciplined reader columns that had looked so impressive on the march from Moscow dissolved into a struggling, fragmented mass of men fighting the terrain as much as the enemy. And that is when the Tatars appeared. Not from the front, from both flanks simultaneously. 30,000 horsemen flowing out of the grassland in a great arc, moving at speed, surrounding the Muscovite cavalry before they could understand what was happening. The maneuver was executed with the precision of something that had been planned and rehearsed. Every unit knew its place. Every direction of retreat was covered. It was not a battle. It was a closing trap. In modern military terminology, this is called an encirclement, a double envelopment, the same tactical concept that Hannibal used at Cannae, that the Mongols used for centuries, that every military genius since antiquity has dreamed of executing, and almost none have managed as perfectly as this. You draw the enemy forward, fix their front, then fold both flanks inward simultaneously until they have nowhere to go. Vyhovsky and Mehmed IV Giray had pulled it off against one of the largest armies in the world. At the same moment, and this is the coordination that shows the genuine sophistication of what was planned here, Khmelnytsky and his 4,000-man garrison burst out of Konotop's gates. They had been holding for 3 months, but now they charged directly into the rear of the Muscovite siege lines, hitting the infantry and artillery, while all the cavalry was gone, committed to the pursuit south of town. Trubetskoy suddenly found himself attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. His cavalry was gone, swallowed by the marshes and the encirclement. His siege lines were being assaulted by the garrison he thought was on the verge of surrender. His artillery was deployed for siege work, not for repelling a field assault. And from the south, the sound of what was happening to his horsemen was reaching him. The rolling thunder of massed fighting, screaming men, horses in panic, the flat crack of gunfire, and then, increasingly, silence. The silence was the worst part. When 20,000 horsemen stop making noise, it means they are dead. Let's go back to the moment the trap closed, because the details matter. Princes Pozharsky and Lvov had committed their cavalry, with the aggressive confidence of men who had never truly been beaten. These were experienced commanders. They had fought in multiple campaigns. They had seen the Tatars before, or rather, they had chased the Tatars before, and the Tatars had always eventually retreated. That was the pattern they knew. That was the pattern their entire understanding of this enemy was built on, and Vyhovsky had used that understanding against them. When the Cossack decoy force crossed back over the Azuk, the Muscovite cavalry came after them in a rush that sacrificed formation for speed. In the scramble across the ford and the boggy ground flanking it, units got separated. But riders who had maintained disciplined formations on the march were now scattered in small groups, each fighting through the marshy terrain independently, unable to see their neighbors through the reeds, unable to hear orders over the splash and struggle of horses in soft ground. And then the Tatars came. The first sign was the sound, a rumble from both sides simultaneously, growing fast, too fast. Men in the middle of crossing the Azuk looked up and saw on both flanks the horizon moving, a horizon of horses, a moving wall that stretched left and right as far as any eye could see, flowing toward them at the gallop. Some units tried to form up, to create those disciplined defensive squares that reiters were trained to use when cavalry threatened. But you cannot form a defensive square when you are knee-deep in a bog with your horse mired and your company scattered across 100 yards of wetland. The Muscovite cavalry was caught in exactly the worst possible state, dispersed, disoriented, with no solid ground to form on, no room to maneuver, and an enemy that was designed specifically to exploit exactly this kind of situation. The Tatars did not crash into them like a wave. They swarmed. They enveloped. They hit the flanks of scattered groups before those groups could cluster together. They cut off retreats. They drove separated riders into the bogs and left them there. The famous Tatar tactic of harassing, circling, shooting, withdrawing, and harassing again was devastating against men who could not maneuver. And when the main Cossack cavalry under Vyhovsky's own command hit the front, that was the killing blow. Muscovite units that had been struggling through the marsh, already disorganized, already flanked on both sides, now faced a direct assault from ahead. There was no direction left that offered escape. Prince Semyon Pozharsky was captured. In the chaos of the battle, still fighting, still trying to rally his disintegrating force around him, he was taken alive. He was brought before Khan Mehmed IV Giray himself. And here is a moment that tells you everything about how these men saw the world. Pozharsky, captive, humiliated, his army destroyed around him, looked at the Khan and refused to bow. He insulted him, directly. By some accounts, he spat at him. A man who had just watched his command annihilated, who had led thousands of men into a trap, who was now a prisoner, and he still could not bring himself to show respect to someone he considered beneath him. The Khan had him executed on the spot. Think about that decision. Not just Pozharsky's decision to insult the Khan. That is a kind of fatal pride that is tragic and almost comprehensible. The arrogance of a man who has lost everything and refuses to lose his contempt as well. Think about the decision that put him there in the first place. The decision to charge forward without orders, without reconnaissance, without understanding the ground. The decision that was born from the same contempt for Vyhovsky, for the Cossacks, for the Tatars, for the idea that these people could possibly have prepared something he could not see coming. Arrogance built the trap. Arrogance walked into it. Now the battle. Not the planning, not the strategy. The actual blood. The encirclement closes. 30,000 Tatar horsemen fold inward from both flanks. Vyhovsky's Cossacks push from the front. The bog holds the Muscovites in place, like amber holds an insect. The Muscovite reiters fight back. Give them that. These are not cowards. They are trained, disciplined soldiers who know their trade. Where solid ground exists, they form up. Pistols level. Fire at point-blank range into the surging Tatar horsemen. Sabers drawn, fighting in tight knots. Men standing over fallen comrades, refusing to break. Officers screaming orders, holding thin lines together through sheer force of personality and voice. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because there is no retreat. There is no flank that isn't covered. There is no reinforcement coming, because Khmelnytsky has burst out of Konotop and hit the siege lines, and Trubetskoy's infantry is fighting for its own survival. The pockets of resistance hold for a while, an hour, maybe more in some places. And then they shrink. One by one, the clusters of fighting men are whittled down to nothing. Horses killed, men dragged from saddles, ammunition exhausted, strength giving out. The marsh doesn't care about your training or your bravery. It holds you still and lets the enemy work. By mid-afternoon, it is over. The figures given in sources are staggering. Some estimates suggest 5,000 dead on the battlefield itself. Others go higher. 8,000, 10,000. The prisoners taken were enormous in number, and many were subsequently killed or sold into Tatar slavery. The total loss in killed, and wounded, captured, and drowned may have reached 30,000 men from the cavalry force alone. The cream of Muscovite noble cavalry, the Dvoryanskaya Konitsia, the sons of the provincial gentry who formed the backbone of the Russian mounted arm, was essentially erased. Entire noble families lost their heirs in a single afternoon. The military registry of the next years shows the catastrophic gaps. Noble families that had provided cavalry service for generations simply gone. The male line ended in the marshes outside Konotop. Prince Lvov escaped. Pozharsky did not, as we have seen. Trubetskoy, left with his infantry, his artillery, and the horror of what had happened, did the only rational thing. He retreated. He fell back from Konotop with everything he had left, abandoning his siege equipment, his supply wagons, on everything that could not move fast enough, and he marched his shattered army north, back toward Moscow. He left behind his dead and his glory in the marshes of the Azush River. The Cossack garrison of Konotop, Khmelnytsky's 4,000 men, who had held for 3 months against 60,000, who had sacrificed themselves to keep the trap baited, burst out of their gates and watched the greatest army Muscovy had put in the field turn and run. Short sentences now. The trap worked. The cavalry died. The army fled. And the world would never be the same. The news reached Moscow in early July 1659. Tsar Alexis, who would one day be called Tsar Alexis the Quiet by historians, a magnificently ironic nickname, did not take it quietly. Contemporary accounts describe him appearing in public in mourning dress, his face hollow, his eyes red. The city of Moscow went into formal mourning. Bells rang, churches filled, and somewhere in the Kremlin's stone corridors, behind the thick walls that shut out the summer heat, the Tsar and his advisors sat with maps and tried to understand what had just happened to them. What had happened was this: the most important military force in Muscovite Russia, The cavalry arm that was supposed to be the decisive instrument of the Tsar's expansion into Ukraine had been functionally destroyed, not weakened, destroyed. The men who died at Konotop had been the sons of the dvoryanstvo, the provincial nobility, and their deaths left a gap in Russian military capacity that would take years to fill. Orders went out immediately. Mobilize everything. The garrisons of every city in western Muscovy were put on alert. There were genuine fears in Moscow that Vyhovsky and Mehmed IV Giray might not stop at Konotop, that they might keep coming north, raiding deep into Russian territory, perhaps even threatening the city itself. Fortifications were hurriedly inspected and reinforced. A defensive screen was assembled. The triumphant Muscovite army had left, expecting to conquer. What straggled back was frightened and looking over its shoulder. That fear tells you everything about the scale of what had happened. But now, and here is where history gets complicated, painful, and deeply human, the victory began to eat itself. Vyhovsky had won. He had won brilliantly, completely, at odds that should have been impossible. He had demonstrated that the Cossack Hetmanate was militarily capable of defending its independence against the greatest power in the region. And he had the momentum. He had the prestige. And within months, he had lost everything. The Tatar alliance that had been so decisive at Konotop came with a price that the ordinary Cossacks, the rank and file, the common men of the Hetmanate, were not willing to pay. The Tatars raided as they marched. They took prisoners from Ukrainian villages, Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, the same people the Cossacks were supposedly fighting to protect. Thousands of ordinary Ukrainians ended up in Tatar slave markets as a consequence of the victory that was supposed to free them. The political backlash was devastating. Vyhovsky's Cossack officers, who had been suspicious of him from the beginning, had their ammunition. He was selling them to the Tatars. He was selling them to the Poles, and he had abandoned the real alliance with the Orthodox Tsar in Moscow for an alliance with Muslim horsemen and Catholic nobles. The accusations were unfair. Vyhovsky was trying to navigate an impossible situation, but they were effective. By late 1659, a rival hetman had been elected in the Eastern Hetmanate. By 1660, Vyhovsky had resigned and fled into exile in Poland. He was eventually captured and executed by Polish authorities, the very allies he had fought to join, on accusations of treason. The man who had engineered the most spectacular Cossack victory of the century died alone, betrayed by nearly everyone who had reason to be grateful to him. The Hetmanate fractured. Without unified leadership, it could not sustain its independence. Moscow returned, more cautious this time, less arrogant, but ultimately more persistent. The Treaty of Pereyaslavl was renegotiated, the terms tightened, the Muscovite grip over the Cossack institutions strengthened. Slowly, year by year, decade by decade, the autonomy that Vyhovsky had bled for was stripped away. The period that followed Konotop in Ukrainian history is called by historians the ruin, ruina in Ukrainian. It is one of the most accurate names in all of historical nomenclature. From approximately 1657 to 1687, the Cossack Hetmanate tore itself apart in a series of civil wars, foreign interventions, and factional slaughters that left Ukraine depopulated, its economy shattered, and its political institutions hollowed out. Hetman succeeded hetman in rapid, violent succession. Some died in battle, some were executed by their own officers, some fled into exile. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fought Muscovy over Ukrainian territory. The Ottomans invaded from the south, the Tatars raided from the east. Ordinary Ukrainians fled in massive numbers, to the forests, to the Don steppe, to anywhere that was not the battlefield that their homeland had become. By the time the Ruina ended, the Hetmanate was a shadow of what Khmelnytsky had built. The eastern bank of the Dnieper River, the left bank, was under Muscovite suzerainty. The right bank, contested and devastated, was largely depopulated. The dream of the Treaty of Hadiak, a Cossack nation as equal partner in a great commonwealth, was dust. Konotop, in this light, looks less like the turning point that saved Ukraine and more like the last great moment before the catastrophe. Vyhovsky won his battle. He proved that it was militarily possible to defeat Muscovy's best armies. And then everything that was not military, the politics, the alliances, the internal divisions, the human cost of the Tatar alliance, undid the victory. The lesson is a painful one, and it echoes forward through Ukrainian history. External military genius cannot substitute for internal political unity. You cannot win independence for a people who are divided about whether they want it, or divided about what it means, or divided about the price they are willing to pay. By 1709, after the Battle of Poltava, where Tsar Peter the Great crushed the last great Cossack bid for independence under Hetman Ivan Mazepa, the Hetmanate was fatally compromised. By 1764, Catherine the Great abolished the office of Hetman entirely. Ukraine was absorbed into the Russian Empire. The Cossack host was broken apart and its traditions suppressed. The battle that was supposed to prevent all of this had not prevented it. Konotop bought time, but not freedom. Imagine standing there, knowing that you fought perfectly, that you planned brilliantly, that you won completely. And it still wasn't enough, because the enemy you defeated was too large, too persistent, and too patient to be stopped by even the most devastating single defeat. Because your own people, the people you were trying to protect, were too divided, too exhausted, too afraid to sustain the fight after the victory. That is one of the cruelest lessons of history. Sometimes, you can win the battle and still lose the war. Not because you were wrong, not because you were weak, but because the forces arrayed against you are larger than any single brilliant day can overcome. But here is what Konotop tells us that matters beyond the 17th century. It tells us that size is not the same as strength, that the largest army in the room is not automatically the most dangerous one, that an enemy who has studied the ground, who has controlled the narrative, who has chosen the place and the moment of contact, that enemy is lethal, regardless of their numbers. Vyhovsky had perhaps a third of Trubetskoy's manpower, maybe less. He had political enemies within his own ranks. He had allies whose loyalty was commercial, not ideological. He had a garrison of 4,000 men tasked with absorbing 3 months of punishment from 60,000. By every conventional metric, he was losing before the battle started. And yet he won, because he understood something that Trubetskoy, in all his confidence, in all his power, had failed to understand. That the battlefield is not won by the army that has the most men. It is won by the army that most completely controls what the other army believes. Trubetskoy believed the Cossack force that rode into the open south of Konotop was desperate and stupid. He believed it because he wanted to believe it, because believing it made the situation simple and the path forward obvious. And Vyhovsky had given him exactly the situation that would produce exactly that belief. That is the real lesson of Konotop. Not cavalry tactics, not terrain analysis. The real lesson is this: your enemy's confidence is a resource. Their certainty is a vulnerability. The moment they stop imagining what they cannot see, the moment they decide the game is already won, that is the moment you have them. This lesson is not limited to the 17th century steppe. It is not limited to warfare. Every negotiation, every competition, every human conflict at every scale operates on the same principle. The side that controls perception, that engineers what the other side believes, holds the decisive advantage, regardless of every other number. Vyhovsky was brilliant. He was also betrayed. He was also ultimately overwhelmed by forces he could not control. His own people's divisions, his allies' brutality, the sheer implacable mass of Muscovite power and patience. His story is not a simple triumph. It is something more honest than that. It is the story of a man who achieved the impossible and then watched it slip away. Because in the long contest of nations, one day, even a perfect day, even a day of genius, is rarely enough. History is not kind to the perfect victories of small states, but it remembers them, even when governments try to suppress them, and Soviet-era historians largely did suppress the Battle of Konotop for obvious reasons. The memory survives. It survives in Ukrainian folk songs, in Cossack tradition, in the archives that outlasted the censors. And now, in the 21st century, Konotop has been reclaimed. Ukraine designated June 28th, a day of national memory. The battle that Muscovite historians preferred to forget is now part of the national story of a people who have been fighting for recognition and survival for a very long time. There is something fitting about that, something almost symmetrical. The battle that was designed to be forgotten by Moscow, by those who won the long game, refused to stay buried, just like the people it belongs to. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what did you know about Konotop before today? Had you heard of Vyhovsky? Had you heard of the battle? For most people outside Ukraine and Poland, this is completely new territory. And I think that's worth talking about. The gaps in what we know about history are themselves a kind of history. If this video gave you something, a new perspective, a story you'll carry with you, a few hours of feeling genuinely absorbed by the past, hit that subscribe button. Not because I'm asking you to, but because this is what we do here. When we find the battles that changed the world and didn't make the textbooks, we find the leaders who won and then lost, and then were erased. We find the moments where the future hung on a few thousand men in a marsh outside a small Ukrainian town, and we try to understand what it meant. There are so many more of these stories. I'll see you at the next one. And remember this, the most dangerous thing you can ever do in a contest of any kind is decide, before it's over, that you've already won. That is the lesson of Konotop. That is what 50,000 men learned in the marshes of the Azuk River on a June afternoon in 1659. And it is as true today as it was then. Some lessons cost everything to teach. Let's make sure we're paying attention.